Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to continue with structuralism and we'll have a very brief recap of what we did earlier, right? So we looked into structuralist chickens and liberal humanist eggs. We saw the science of fathers and then Saussure and his contribution to structuralism and his three pronouncements. Please don't forget any of these arbitrary, that language is arbitrary, the meanings of words are relational, that language itself is constitutive as opposed to being reflecting the world. And we also looked into the distinction made by Saussure on Lang and Perrault. Well, in passing, we spoke about Northrop Frye and Pierre Sanders as well, and their own distinctions about signifying systems and the genres as well, right? So we also looked into the scope of structuralism, what possibilities there was of translating structuralism to into the other different different areas of life or different areas of study, and how well the study of linguistics or language in particular could be applied to literature. We looked into Strauss' interpretation of myth, how he used the idea of Lang and Perrault, and yeah, we got into a certain dyadic structures, dyadic pairs, and we looked into how the movement, well, the structuralist movement went from particular to general, from a particular literary text to the entire genre or the structure it belonged to, or we're not. See, we also have to remember we're not simply speaking about a text and the genre it belongs to, but we are also talking about the entire, the culture it comes from, the mythic background it comes from. So, all the conventions, the conventional background it comes from, all of it. And we looked into how this these signifying systems work in our day-to-day lives, in day-to-day events. And this was understood by Roland Barthes, right? Later on in his mythologies, where he saw the difference between boxing, wrestling, and the significance behind all of these, the owning of a certain car, or the image of a certain actor, or a certain photograph. How the values, beliefs, and symbols determine the actions of the people of that time, right? So, for instance, if a person uh, automatically, you know, kisses his fingers. All right. You imagine you're moving in a bus. You're traveling in a bus, and if someone automatically kisses his own fingers, um, someone who does not belong to, who is not familiar with the culture of this place, will wonder what it was all about. But someone who has seen it all and who knows a little bit about it would know that that person has actually passed a temple and is offering respects, probably, yeah, to his deity, whoever he worships. So you see how certain symbols or certain actions have a certain significance, right? And how they are grounded in certain structures of practices, right? Now, we also saw what the structuralist critics do generally, and we looked into a basically something that has been devised by Peter Barry. We looked into a diverse set of practices of the structuralist critics. We saw how I want to really go through it just once, so that because we are going to use a structuralist example today, right? So it would be better for us to go through it once. So basically, a structuralist critic, what does he do? He analyzes prose narratives relating to the text to some larger containing structure, the conventions of a particular literary genre, basically where the genre comes from, what the practices of that genre are, a network of textual connections. You are going to, that is, as a structuralist critic, you would be looking into not merely the text, but connect the text to other texts, all right, and form a network of it to get a better understanding, a bigger understanding. A projected model of an underlying universal narrative structure. You look into the projected model. You project itself, yourself a model of some underlying universal theme, okay, universal theme in terms of narrative structure. How the every tale under the sun has some similarity in the narrative structure. And the notion of narratives is a complex of recurrent patterns and motives. Now, this is what we are going to mainly focus upon in today's example. Please bear this in mind. A notion of narratives as a complex of recurrent patterns and motives. We are going to look at how a narrative is seen as being composed of certain patterns, as in you see designs, right? When you buy a sari, you look at the patterns in it, right? There are figures printed on it, and that figure, that particular design, is intermittently sequentially printed all along the border, all along the borders of the sari, or along the pallu of the sari, as you would call it, right? So that it brings in a harmonious theme. It gives a certain it is pleasing to the eye. It gives an aesthetic effect, right? Aesthetic effect. So we see narratives as a complex of recurrent patterns of motives. The structuralist critic also interprets literature in a range of underlying parallels. You look at the parallels with the structures of language, right? You look into what makes language, and you apply those rules to literature, all right? If you're going to look into the syntax, the semantics, the various rules governing language, like morphemes, phonemes, and all those things, or the phonetic structures of language, or the written structures of language, whatever it is, if when you are going to look at all of those, you apply those rules to language, and you devise something very similar to apply to literature, all right? So we understood a little bit about my themes, right? They also apply the concept of systematic patterning and structuring to the whole field of Western culture and across cultures, treating as systems of science anything from ancient Greek myths to brands of soap powder. You look into everything from Greek mythology, from Roman mythology, from Indian mythology, to even today's basic advertisement you watch on TV or your phone. You assign you treat them as systems of science, okay? As you see them as belonging to a certain system of science, or creating certain systems of science, all right? Now we are going to look at a few examples today. The first one being Balzac's Sarasin. Now, Sarasin is a novella, okay? Balzac was a writer who wrote Sarasin quite a while back. Basically, a French writer who wrote somewhere around 1840s. Okay, now he was instrumental in bringing in a kind of the kind of writing, and the form of writing that was entirely new. Okay, he had a great influence on novelists like Emile Zola, Dickens, Flaubert, because see, all these were practitioners of realistic novels, right? But Balzac was great at creating realistic characters. His characters are complex, morally ambiguous, and fully human. Even his inanimate objects are imbued with character, right? So we are using his Sarasin, which is a novella, which was only of about written in about only 30 pages. Now, Roland Barthes, whom we have already spoken about, uh, a literary critic, he used this as a basis to expound on his theories. Okay, expound on his theories, as in he created this work called Esbarzi. Okay, which is simply a sort of abbreviation of Sarasin and Zambinella. I mean, these are the two main protagonists of the novella. And his understanding of this 30-page novel went on to 200 pages. Why Peter Barry has mentioned the number of pages is because how much you could glean from a structuralist approach of a particular work is what is, it's admirable. So he found some 561 lexemes or units of meaning, okay, and 5 codes, basic underlying structures of all narratives. We are going to learn all these 5 codes, even though we're not going to concern ourselves much with the 561 lexemes or units of meaning here. And he also looked into the voices as such, and he looked into the general criticism. We're not going to concern ourselves with that. But you also have to remember that S bar Z, I don't know how else to pronounce it, that's why I'm simplifying it as S bar Z, is at crossroads in Barthes' career shift from structuralism to post-structuralism. See, you have to remember Barthes' work in both structuralism and post-structuralism, his contribution to both, okay, both movements or both approaches to studying or understanding literature. So it stands somewhere between his 1968 essay analyzing narrative structures and The Pleasure of the Text, which was post-structuralist work, which was his his post-structuralist work. There is another work, The Death of the Author. We will look into that, came somewhere around 1968 as well. So he was going through a phase here. Barthes is going through a phase here. So S bar Z could be seen both as structuralist and deconstructionist in some ways. But we are mainly going to concern ourselves with the structuralist approach because that's what the majority of people have done. That's what Peter Barry himself has done. Okay. So Barthes identifies 5 codes. He identifies 5 basic codes in S bar C: the Hermeneutic Code, the Hermeneutic Code, the Cultural Code, the Symbolic Code, and the Symbolic Code. Okay. I have my own pronunciations here. I don't know how else to pronounce Symbolic Code. I think it is Symbolic Code. Anyway, the Hermeneutic Code provides indications of it. I've simplified all the definitions here. Please do look into the book I've provided for you. But the Hermeneutic Code simply provides indications of actions. Okay, it's simply the narrative drive of the text. Narrative drive of the text as in things happening. The action code. You could call it the action code as well. Like the ship sailed at midnight. So there is an action going on here and you wait for the further action. Right? It is taking things forward. The Hermeneutic Code poses questions. It poses questions or enigmas providing narrative suspense. So basically, you need to concern yourselves with enigma and question. So what a novel or a literary, a story should do is have this elementary component of hermeneutic code. So a structuralist looks into the hermeneutic code of a novel and he finds out what exactly is driving the enigma there. What is it that creates the enigma? For instance, he knocked on a certain door on so and so street would make you eager or anxious to learn more as to what is going to happen. This is Hermeneutic Code is simply an action that carries the story forward, whereas the Hermeneutic Code is the enigma created at a certain point so as to inspire or prepare an audience for knowing more, right? The Cultural Code, it contains references out beyond the text. Okay, it contains references out beyond the text to what is regarded as common knowledge. Now, when we speak of the Cultural Code, what we are doing is we are looking at things that need not be told in the story. Okay, you already have there certain symbols. They might just be some certain indications that automatically are registered in your mind to create a stereotype, a type in your brain. Like for instance, you watch all these Saas Bahu serials. I don't know if they are still being run on the television, but generally, when you look at someone who has this huge, bindu on her forehead and a lot of sindoor, on her forehead, you automatically assume that woman to be very aggressive, right? Someone who is going to create a lot of trouble for the protagonist, or someone who is scheming, yeah, the villain of the piece. So we have been given these stereotypes through culture, or even, for instance, say someone is wearing a Rolex watch, or someone's wearing probably a branded shoes. You automatically assume that person is going to be really wealthy, and you understand that that person is very self-conscious, that person takes the accessories very seriously, so is worried about his or her superficial looks, and probably that person wants to show off a little bit, and doesn't mind wearing good shoes, even if not showing off, doesn't mind wearing good shoes, because he can afford it, simply to afford it, right? We have been uh, conditioned by the culture we live in, or we are accustomed to certain ideas that exist in our unconscious, right? That are there in our under the conscious level, and any hint in the narration triggers that idea in our brains. So automatically we form a judgment without being told explicitly, without being explained it out to us. So cultural code references out. It goes beyond the text to what is regarded as common knowledge, right? So all those axioms we follow, right? Look before you leap, or like, for instance, all those like all men daydream at parties, no matter how lively the party is. It's a normal stuff. It is taken for granted. Of course, there might be men who do enjoy parties, but it seems to be a given. It seems to be a common knowledge, right? As Jane Austen would have her uh, character tell right in the first line, any man in possession of good fortune would be in need of a wife. Okay, maybe I butchered it, I don't know. But as in, just because you're wealthy, just because you have the means, you need to procure a wife. It's a given, it's common knowledge. Anything that is being treated as common knowledge and is there in the minds of everyone, that need not be told explicitly in the story, in the narrative, could be termed as cultural code. It goes beyond the text itself. They evoke a pre existing image or stereotype. So it already exists in our mind. Okay, the image or the stereotype already exists in mind. Like, for instance, Agent Angelus was a kind of man who sometimes arrives at work in odd socks. So the very sentence, this may be a part of narrative, this very sentence evokes a certain image in your mind. The agent himself is. Is a slob. Okay, he doesn't really take very good care of his looks. Or B, he is too hardworking. Yeah, there are certain possibilities. You already get the idea that this person is like too bowed down with responsibilities, and he doesn't have enough time to keep his head straight, or even his socks straight, the color of his socks straight, right? So, cultural code goes beyond the text. The semic code, or the connotative code, is linked to the theme, and this code, when organized around a particular proper name, constitutes a character. Right? Now, semic code would be connotative in nature. Connotative in nature, as in, it would be particular to that nature. Particular in the sense, see, for instance, one word has multiple meanings, and all these meanings go into the making of that word, right? So, for instance, there is one character, and you're given one information at a certain point in the novel. Okay, first the character is shown to be someone who is very lonely. All right. After a gap, say maybe in the next chapter, or maybe after a couple of paragraphs, you get to know that that person has just had a fight with someone, and then maybe in the next paragraph, you see the character realizing her mistake. All right, and then you see how she tries to make up the mistake, and then you see what she does, how she comes across someone and behaves in a certain manner. Or maybe she is gracious or very kind and all that. And see, all these little traits, all these little characteristic traits contribute to the making of that particular character. you are told that that character is wearing a certain kind of gown, okay, and that gown goes right to her chin, on top, right from the chin to the bottom of her heels, she is covered. You get an idea, an image of a prim and proper maiden. And then you see all these are little hints, okay. It could be in relation to the name itself, it should be the costume, it could be the physical appearance, it could be the psychological traits, it could be the speech, it could be the gestures, it could be the text that explains her in some way. All of these hints contribute to the making of the character. All right. So you see, for instance, you are talking about Elizabeth Bennet, right? I believe everyone is familiar with Elizabeth Bennet, Eliza Bennet, Jane Austen's heroine from Pride and Prejudice. So, how do you first see her? You see her amongst her sisters, who are all very eagerly anticipating the arrival of Mr. Bingley, right? And she is shown to be rather ambivalent. She neither, excuse me, she is neither very expressive at that time, nor is she curbing the exuberance of her younger sisters, right? And then you see her at Netherfield, probably where they are meeting, where she's meeting Darcy for the first time, and how she interacts with each and every one. You see her as a very happy-go-lucky kind of person, but at the same time, she's sensitive enough to be taking offense at Darcy's, ignoring her, or Darcy's slight, the slight she suffers at Darcy's hand. And she's also seen to be very kind in the sense she sees all the flaws in the people around her, but still is kind enough to just bear with them without really being offended or making any snide comments about them. And then you move on, and you see her in different lights, how she behaves with Collins, how she behaves with um, the uh, the the aunt, everything. And she is easy to pass judgment, she is easily prejudiced, right? But the overall idea, the general idea we have of her from the beginning to the end is not really explicitly stated out. It is thrown out in terms of hints. At one point, when she goes to visit her sister at Netherfield, when Jane takes ill and she goes to visit her, she is shown as someone having ruddy cheeks. Her cheeks are glowing out there because she has walked the all or some 5 miles or something, and her the hem of her gown is dirty. It's streaked with mud because it has been raining, and it is not proper for her. What you understand from that is that she is kind of impulsive to the, but also her impulsiveness has a very kind origin, has its origin in kindness, or her love for her sister. She cannot bear to be apart from her sister when her sister is ill at a stranger's house. So that has prompted the walk, right? So you see, all these hints, the structuralist critic would look into and observe them, and uh, and create the identity of the character, find out what it is that makes the character. So these are called connotative codes. I think I've gone long enough and taken up quite a bit of time with this. The symbolic code. The symbolic code is linked to theme, just like the semic code, but on a larger scale. On a larger scale, as in, which consists of contrasts and pairings related to the most basic binary polarities. So, whereas semic code is more particular, symbolic code is more, you know, more in line with how the whole narrative is structured, right? So it consists of contrasts and pairings related to the most basic binary polarities. So it is not particular to a particular character or something. It is more general to the narrative itself. So it consists of contrasts and pairings related to the most basic binary polarities, as in male, female, night, day, good, bad, art, a good evil, art, life. So these are all binary oppositions, or you can't really call it oppositions, binary polarities, or binary contrasts, right? So these are the structures of contrasted elements which structuralists see as fundamental to the human way of perceiving and organizing reality. So you look at the symbolic code in various senses. It could be rhetorical, it could be sexual, it could be economic, it could be any form, any form. It could take any form. It could even be in terms of a certain object. It could be in terms of uh, a certain trait that is reflected, in parallels. It could be just about anything. So we have, for our example, to work on the example, we have the oval portrait, which we've already worked on, and well, assignments were written on it from the liberal humanist, viewpoint. So good job, good job, good job for what you've done. Now we will use the same story written by Edgar Allan Poe, The Oval Portrait. Now, our main objective is to treat narrative structure as a complex of recurrent patterns and motives. As I already told you, that this is going to be our today's main concern. Okay, to treat the narrative structure of the oval portrait as a complex of recurrent patterns and motives. We are going to look at all the patterns and try to determine their places. All right. So to start with, we'll just go with the summary. I believe some one or two have not submitted the assignment, so we'll just go with the summary ones. During a civil war in an unnamed European country, a wounded officer takes refuge in a recently abandoned chateau. Okay, the room he sleeps in contains an extremely lifelike portrait of a young woman, and a written account of this portrait, which he finds in the room, tells how the artist was her husband, who had become so carried away with the creation of the portrait that he failed to notice that as life was kindled in the painting, it simultaneously drained away from the sitter. At the end of the tale, the placing of the final touch of color, which renders the portrait perfect, coincides with the death of the sitter. So it's a fairly simple and straightforward plot. There is just a wounded officer who is taking refuge in an abandoned chateau, probably some European country. So he is sleeping in this one room where there is a very lifelike portrait of a young woman, and with it is a written description of the portrait. We don't know who wrote it, because obviously it could not have been written by the artist or the the sitter for the portrait. What we see is that the account tells of how this portrait was created, how this artist was the husband of the woman whose portrait it was, and it was, they were newly married, and this artist went on painting and using his bride as a model for his painting, and he was so engrossed in it, he was so engaged in his painting, that as he put life into his painting, the life in his within the wife diminished gradually. So what we see is, in the end, the woman dies, that is, the wife dies, whereas the portrait is still alive. So there is a major contrast and a wonderful example to work with for looking for patterns in the novel. So the main focus is on trying to figure out the structure, symbol, and design, and there is a verbal diagram created because through trying to understand how the structure works. So while looking for the symbols and designs, you come across various parallels, echoes, reflections, repetitions, contrasts, and patterns. Yeah, you look into the parallels, various parallels, the echoes of a certain part in another part, reflections and repetitions, how a certain thing is being repeated, and contrasts, how certain contrasts are formed, and patterns, you see recurring patterns of certain actions or words or dialogues. You see them all not merely in the structure. You look into it, you look for all of these in plot, the structure of the narrative, the character or the motive of the character, the situation or circumstance in which they find themselves, the language used, and the imageries found. So in all of these, you try to find Parallels, echoes, reflections, repetitions, contrasts, and patterns. So first of all, we will look into the symbolic code. Now, speaking of the symbolic code, we understood it as something that is intrinsically linked with the theme, right? So here the tale has a binary structure, and we are mainly concerned. We are mainly concerned with the symbols, okay, symbols that form the entire essence of the narrative. So here we are going to look at the tale. Look at the tale as a binary structure, which is composed of paired opposites, okay, as in two halves. Basically, the tale has two halves. The first part is a framing narrative containing the first person account of the wounded officer, right? The first part is a framing narrative, as in, like, a picture frame, how a picture has a frame, right? So the first part about the wounded officer, where he is taking refuge in the chateau, it's the framing narrative. Inside it, inside the real picture, is a story within the story, which he reads in the commentary on the painting. All right, so we have double narrative here. All right, so the first the basic narrative, the framing narrative, is of the wounded officer, while the second, or the story within the story, is the commentary on the painting. Now, there is a marked difference in narrative pace between these two halves, as in how they seem to be, going, how the narrative seems to go. It is not in the matter of the words, it is a choice of words that is used that slows down or speeds up a particular narrative, right? So the kind of words or the kind of sentence structures that are used in the first, that is a frame narrative, is leisurely. It is ponderous. Ponderous as in it is very thoughtful, reflecting the down-to-earth rationalistic mind of the officer. Right? It is very reasonable. It is something that you and I would do. Right? Now the second narrative, that is the story within the story, moves with increasingly disjointed rapidity. Increasingly disjointed rapidity, as in it is really going fast and there is no sense to it. It just goes on, reflecting the frenzy of artistic creation. How an artist in his throes totally forgets everything and is going haphazardly without having any direction or design, right? So it reflects the frenzy of the artistic creation and the rapid downward spiral of the victim. It shows how rapidly, how fast the sitter is going towards her death, hurtling towards her death, right? It is not slow, it is not thoughtful, it is not reasoned out, right? Now the third idea is that the chateau itself performs very different functions in two halves, right? The place, the mansion where the wounded officer has taken refuge in, that itself seems to be taking different functions in each narrative. In the first half, that is in the framing narrative, it is a place of refuge. Place of refuge because the wounded officer, the officer himself, is unable to move or with any expediency towards safety. So he has found a certain safety, certain refuge in that place, right? So that place is a place of refuge. And recuperation as in he is recuperating from his wounds, right? So where he finds safety from his enemies and probably recovers his health. We don't know. We are not it's a very brief story, so it does not extend to the point where we see any future for the wounded officer, but we can assume that the officer has recovered there. Okay, recovered his health there. In the second half, that is in the second narrative, the enclosed narrative, what we see is that it is the chateau itself is a place of danger and ultimately destruction for the sitter. Danger and destruction. See, here is a man who has married a girl and he has brought her home, and instead of taking care of her, bringing her joy, what he is doing is taking away his life, inadvertently taking away his life. It's not like he's a criminal. Maybe it's a practice of his, we don't know, but it is very much an echo of the some myth. I'm forgetting what exactly it is. Okay, so here in the second half, it is a place of danger. Okay, it is a place of danger and ultimately destruction for the sitter. So it is in stark opposite, right? Where she is delivered to the whims of her artist husband. So she is, at the mercy of the artist husband here, mercy of the choice of the whatever he wishes he could do to her. Artist husband, and her life is drained away. Now, each half features a relationship between two people with unequal distribution of power within each with different effects. So, in each part in the framing narrative or in the enclosed narrative, what you see is there is an unequal distribution of power. There is there is the officer and the valet in the first part, there is the artist and his wife in the second. You may wonder who the powerful here is in the first part, because the valet is there, he is mentioned by name, whereas the officer, though he is wounded, it is on his whim that the valet stays. Okay, the valet cannot leave him. The valet is unable to leave the officer to his mercies. He tries to procure whatever is necessary for the officer, and is willing to stay and has to stay. Feels the need to stay with the officer as long as the officer cannot move from there. The same goes for the second part as well. There is the unequal distribution of power. The officer is not attending on the valet is attending on the officer. All right. Now the artist, he too is he too is more seen as more powerful than wife, because the wife subsequently loses her life to the whims of the artist husband. So there is an unequal distribution of power. So here are two questions, not from me, but from Peter Barry. He asks, the main actors in the two halves are respectively the wounded officer and the artist. What contrasts are observable in the mental state of these two? Please think it out, and this could be your assignment for today. Both the officers in the first part and the artist in the second are engrossed in a painting, right? Both of them are fascinated by the painting. Officer, he just looks on into the painting and he is getting into it's kind of, he's going into a stance, right? Into a trance. But the role of art in the two halves is supposed to be very typo error. The role of art in the two halves is very different. What exactly is the contrast? So you need to figure out what role the painting is playing in both these people's mind, the officer and the artist. All right? Make it very brief. You need not write an essay on it. There are further contrasts as far as symbolic code is concerned. There is a strongly implied contrast between the husband's self-absorbed artistic frenzy on the one hand, and a more conventional, outwardly directed sexual passion of the kind which might be expected in a husband for a new bride. Instead of being fascinated by her, this husband is entranced before his work in autoerotic erotic contemplation. The marriage itself is bigamous, husband having a bride in his art, a sustained negative parody of honeymoon. So you see, there are certain contrasts formed here. The artistic frenzy as opposed to the kind of fascination the husband should have for his wife or for his new wife. And then we see how the marriage itself seems to be bigamous, because the husband seems to be married to his art. He doesn't need another wife here, because he seems to be more fascinated by his art, right? So there is a negative parody of honeymoon. He's spending more time with his art than with his wife. And then narrative mechanisms like presentation, language, and content. You see, there are parallels drawn between the narratives of the two halves. Both have a degree of anonymity. So we not only see the contrast, we also see certain parallels here, right? So there is a degree of anonymity. We don't know who the narrator is. We are not told the name of either of the narratives. Neither the wounded officer, except for that he is an officer, that he took part in certain civil war. We don't know anything else about him. He is anonymous. There is no name to him. Again, the one who wrote the commentary on the painting, we don't know anything about that person. Even that person is anonymous. So there is anonymity, a degree of anonymity is maintained in both the narrators. Okay. And Barthes encourages to ask Whipale, who is speaking? So see, from the point of narratology, we, not merely structuralist point of view, we are made to ask, we are encouraged to ask who is speaking. We need to know who is speaking. So we already have established a distinction between the author and the narrator, right? So you could very well ask who the narrator is. So there are certain examples, more generalized contrasts and conflicts as basic dyads. There is a contrast of male female as in the more dominant one, and life and art, which one seems to be more dominant here. Art seems to dominate here. And in light and dark, how light seems to be flooding this one particular and the first narrative, whereas it is entirely dark in the second narrative. And looking and doing, again a contrast, a conflict of, the officer is merely looking, whereas the artist is actively employed, as in doing, engaged in doing. And reality and representation. So now this is a very complex question here. You may wonder, which is reality? Is the officer looking at the painting the reality, and the painting itself is a representation of a certain past, something that happened in the past? Or is this itself, the reality is something that happened earlier, that would be the reality, and it is being represented in the painting? Yeah, it's a circle. This question could go in circles. So as D.H. Lawrence says, never trust the moral, trust the tale. I had to put it here because, see, most of the time the story seems to be telling something, but is actually telling you something else entirely, different, or even the opposite of what it seems to tell. So that would be the core of our understanding for deconstruction. But right now, we still have a little way to go with our structuralist criticism. We'll continue it tomorrow in the next video. Thank you so much. Jazakallah wa khair. Stay safe and be happy. Assalamu alaikum.